Hi, and welcome back, everybody, to the technology stage here at RNS. My name is Kelly Cristaldi, and I am so excited and eager to welcome you back. We just had a really great session with our Director of Product, Jason Van Loo, and of course with Vance Roosh, the CEO and founder of Overflow, where we talked a lot about diversifying your giving, especially as nonprofits look to gain new modern donors, and a lot of that can come in the form of non-cash assets like stock giving and cryptocurrency. But in today's session, I am so excited to welcome our very own trainer, Rachel Specht, to talk with us a lot about automation. And this is something that we talk a lot about here at Virtuous because, of course, at the heart of everything we do is responsiveness. And how do we be responsive? Well, it's by personalizing things. And personalizing our outreach and communications with donors is wonderful. But the big question always lies in, how do we properly scale those efforts while minimizing efforts on our staff? So I'm really excited to welcome Rachel to the stage, albeit virtually from DC. I wish she was here with us here today in Phoenix, Arizona. But Rachel, it's so good to have you. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's so good to be here, even though here is not there. It's here in DC, but still so excited to join. Wish I was there in sunny Phoenix, Arizona. But hey, we'll make it rock today. So excited to be here. So excited to be doing this. So excited to talk automation.
Yeah, me too. And you know what? While we have you, why don't you go ahead and give us a really brief introduction of what you do here at Virtuous and how you help our customers?
Yeah, so I'm on the training team here at Virtuous. So think about all of the content that comes out regarding just learning how the platform works, right? Video content, articles, support articles, things like that. One-on-one trainings, whether it's during onboarding or whether it's after onboarding, maybe you get a new team member on. My team and what I do here is we make these resources available to be able to basically just teach how the platform works. There are a lot of intricacies to it. There's a lot of cool things you can do. It can be applied in all kinds of different ways, depending on the organization you work at, what your role is at the organization. So ultimately, my goal is to make sure people feel confident, comfortable, and empowered to use the platform.
And you know what, Rachel, I hear from our customers all the time about the work that you do with them, and you really do stand by those values. I hear compliments all the time about how wonderful and empowering your training is. So I know that today's session is really going to be a sneak peek of what it's like to work with you as one of our best trainers here at Virtuous. So just a really brief introduction of myself. You've seen me on the tech stage yesterday and today, really this entire week. But if this is our first chance meeting virtually, I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Virtuous, and I like to liken my job like an octopus. I have a tentacle in just about every department here, where we're really trying to bring together our product through either our volunteer, our giving, or our fundraising platforms, and intersecting that with our customers. Really leaning in and listening to both the market and to our current customers of what's going on in the product. How are we really helping you build better, which is one of our key mission statements, and then ensuring that our platforms actually are meeting and even exceeding the goals that you have in mind for your organization. So this is just a real pleasure to be able to sit down and speak about automation, which is one of my personal favorite things in our platform, along with a few others, but automation is really just one of my favorite ones. But to kick us off, you know, Rachel, this is I feel like it's nice to kind of set the stage with a question, and I would love for everyone to drop your answers in the chat. Is what fears do you have around automation? And Rachel, I'm sure you're hearing a ton of fears about automation when you're working one-on-one with our customers.
Yeah, and like I know some of the things that I hear around, like what happens if I mess up or the wrong thing goes to the wrong person. I remember back in my old org that I used to work at, and I went on my own automation journey for myself. My fear was, am I doing this right? Right?
Yes.
And that kind of thought fills into that fear around mistakes as well. Like if I'm not doing this right, what if I make a mistake? It's new to me. And whenever we're working with new things, it's kind of intimidating. Right? That is the uncomfortable part of learning generally, whether it's automation, whether it's something completely different. So I hear all kinds of different things, but rest assured that if you have fears around automation, you are certainly not alone.
Yeah, you're certainly not. And fun fact, I've been in marketing for well over 10 years, both as a nonprofit fundraiser and marketer, and of course here at Virtuous, and automation still gives me the heebie-jeebies. There are still some days where I need to hit that go button, and I do get a little apprehensive about it. So trust me, it is something that is felt wherever you are. But to kick things off, Rachel, I'd love to really hear a little bit more about what is automation. It sounds kind of like this crazy buzzword, right? And let's kind of break it down for folks into what exactly is it?
Yeah, so all automation really is a series of events where if a condition or multiple conditions are met, then an action or a series of actions is going to happen, right? To really sum it up with a few symbols in here, right? If A, then B. If this thing happens, then another thing happens, right? If, then. If and when. When this thing happens, then another thing happens. So let's pull this into something that's a little more applied here. So for example, we might say, hey, if a donor makes their first time donation, then I might want to have one of our development staff reach out to them, right? That is something that can be automated. Now you'll see a lot of different terms for what those things actually are in different platforms, right? So in Virtuous, A is the steps, B is the actions. If I have a non-donor step, then I have this series of actions happening for them. In Zapier, it's kind of thought up as triggers and actions. So A being the triggers, B being the actions. So a lot of different platforms have different words for it, right? Automation is something that's available through a number of different platforms, but it all comes down to this theory, this principle here. If this thing happens, then another thing happens. So while the looks may vary in terms of how it looks in a platform, the outcome is the same. It's all pretty much the same. So for example, when we look at two-factor authentication, which I think maybe a few IT managers might be on here and they're all hoping like we're all using it, think of that, right? Whenever you try to sign in somewhere, that triggers the ability to have a text message be sent to you or have a push notification go to some sort of 2FA app, right? And it happens once you hit that submit button for your password. Now, that's really the spirit of that. That's kind of an automation in itself. So ultimately, it depends on data that exists in the database. So the data has to be good. It has to be set up. We'll have more on that later. But ultimately, it all comes down to this if this, then that theory and methodology.
That is a great breakdown of what it is. Just kind of having that, like, if it's A and then it's B, and then there's all these other like little sub things that'll kind of happen. You know, in my mind, I almost picture it like a domino effect that sets off like a, you know, you touch the little domino at the beginning and then it sets off a whole chain of events. But, you know, here's kind of a view of what that would look like in Virtuous. And Rachel, I'm going to kick this back over to you so you can actually walk us through this image.
Yeah, and so I've already given a couple very basic examples of this. So in the second part of that previous slide, like we had A, then B, and then A, then B1, B2, B3, etc. So this is an example of how that set of dominoes, as Kelly has laid out, can really go through in here. So for example, we have, you know, these two steps in Virtuous, okay? You know, this is a screenshot of something that lives in Virtuous. So for that first step, we see, hey, life-to-date giving greater than 1K. So for that, we see that, hey, a task has been assigned to a development rep to make a follow-up call. A task has been assigned to the director of development to make a handwritten thank you card, and an email can be sent. So that's just one experience for people who might hit that $1,000 life-to-date giving milestone. But what if they go up to $5,000 life-to-date giving? Well, now that's got its own set of actions in there, right? Instead of having the development rep make a follow-up call, that can be the director of development making that follow-up call. Instead of the director of development making a thank you card, that CEO can make a thank you card, right? So it can vary a little bit to make the experience somewhat different between these two, but somewhat similar, right? Mm-hmm. We'll talk a little bit more about that personalization of that, but you may guess now, I may have given a little bit of a spoiler that this can still be personal ultimately. So there are a lot of different ways you can set up these different experiences for these different sets of audiences in here.
That's excellent. This is such a great example too, because yesterday we were talking a little bit about automation too, and specifically if someone makes a certain gift and like how do they get, you know, moved over to a different bucket. This is a really great example of that. Granted, at that point we were talking about first-time donors, rather life-to-date giving, but you know the principle is kind of the same. But really, let's talk a little bit as well as like why automate. So we all know that automation is something that we really practice and preach here at Virtuous because it's a great way to scale relationships with your donors. But there's a couple other aspects to it as well that you may not always think of. So first and foremost, it can save your team time and money. Remember, staff time does equate to something financial. This is something that we thought about a lot at my previous nonprofit is how much does my hourly wage or my salary equate to the time that I'm spending on certain projects? If I'm spending a lot of time, if my team is spending, let's say 10, 15 hours a week, really trying to dig into something, that's going to equate to, if it's 1 to 2 people, it could be as much as like $1,000 to $2,000 a week spent on that particular piece that we could just simply automate. So it's really saving us time and it's saving our organization money because now my team can actually focus on other endeavors. It also makes every donor feel like a major donor, which is really at the heart of it as well. We really want to try and deepen those relationships. We don't want to do the spray and pray mentality where everyone feels just they're all in the same boat. We really want to make sure that everyone feels that special, deep connection because how do we grow our connections with our donors? It's by making them feel really special and treating them like that major donor that really they could be. And there's so much more. Rachel, do you have anything else that you really could, why automate?
Yeah, I mean, it's for a lot of different things, right? It can be for outreach. It can be for internal database management. There are a lot of different purposes for it. And we use kind of a lot of similar examples of like, okay, non-donors, first-time donors, giving milestones, things like that. But it doesn't even have to be around donors. It can be around volunteers. It can be around just capturing event attendees to follow up with them. It can be celebrating birthdays. It can be anything that can really help you connect with your supporters, whether they're making donations, whether they're volunteering, whether they're just here to support however they can, right? It's really building a lot of different opportunities there to have any kind of connection. And I think that's really the spirit of this.
Absolutely. And before I move on, one of my favorite case studies we ever did around automation was with the Western Dominican Providence. Fabulous organization out west, and they actually utilized automation because I think a lot of it too, to your point, is we think about it as a way to scale and personalize connections with our donors, but you can do so much more with it. Their team actually ended up saving, I think, something like 10 hours a week simply by automating the receipting process post-donation from a donor. That's incredible. No longer was their, I believe it was their donor or their database administrator, was she having to export information only to import it back into their previous legacy CRM and then to have all these handwritten receipts go out. Now they had an automation workflow in place that handled all of that for them. Boom, that saves them 10 hours a week, which is incredible, of like really manual work that then she can then go on and do other things. Maybe she can, I don't know, focus on other more like mission impactful projects, which is really wonderful. And so there are just a plethora of options. Excellent.
Yeah, and I mean, 10 hours a week, like,
oh my gosh.
I imagine all of us, if we all had an extra 10 hours in a week, like the things we could do.
The
incredible.
things, indeed, that we could all do. It would be incredible. But, what can you automate? There's quite a few here as well. You can welcome new givers. Rachel, can you tell us a little bit more about what it would be like to welcome new givers with an automation?
Yeah, and there are a lot of different variations you can take on this. You can take a very basic variation where we say, hey, if you make your first time gift, we're going to go through this journey. Maybe we take this opportunity to let donors know about all the cool things we have going on, maybe even try to convert them into second time donors, maybe recurring donors. Right? But then you can even expand on that more, right? There are different kinds of first-time givers you have there. So for example, you might have the first-time giver who makes $10 as their first donation, but what if your first-time donor makes a $10,000 donation? You could still have a different experience for that. So there could be subsets of your first-time givers to basically, again, thank them for all they're doing, show them the impact that they're having, and then show them what next steps to make. And that's all part of our responsive framework too, right? We see you did this thing. I see you doing that thing. Let's connect. Now I want to make a suggestion for how you can continue supporting. and then we can go through the cycle again. So again, a lot of infinite possibilities just within this first thing that you could automate here.
That's exactly it. And speaking of really momentous donations like that, by the way, I would have absolutely fainted if someone's first gift to my animal welfare organization I used to work for was $10,000. I'd be like fainting on a fainting couch, just, carry me away kind of thing. But you can also use automation to celebrate milestones. What about those, to your example earlier, those life to date giving? Once they hit that 1,000, that 5,000, that 10,000, like really using automation to recognize and celebrate those milestones. And it's not manual on your team. How could we actually incorporate different aspects into a workflow to celebrate those milestones and alert teams that those milestones have been achieved?
Yeah, and so the example I showed earlier, it's basically saying, hey, I have one audience in which they've made $1,000 in giving life to date, and another has given $5,000 life to date. Now, you can choose different milestones for that. We have statistics available in Virtuous for life to date giving, fiscal year giving, all kinds of different calculations to be like, hey, we're taking what this person gave throughout the year or the fiscal year, and then calculating that, storing that on the record so that you can do this. So we can look for those donors. Who has given more than 5,000 life to date? Who has given 10,000 life to date? When was their last gift? And that's not just donation-based milestones. We have volunteer-based milestones. So we can say, oh my gosh, you volunteered 100 hours this year, right? That is no small thing. So we can celebrate what our donors do. We can celebrate what our volunteers do. We can celebrate all kinds of different things. Again, birthdays, anniversaries, all kinds of celebrations, even beyond just contributions to the organization. Again, this is all part of just recognizing that our supporters are humans, right? They have birthdays. They have things in their life they're celebrating. Maybe things in their life that aren't going so well. This can really help us to alert to those different things because these are data points that are stored in Virtuous and can also possibly be stored in other databases.
That's exactly it. And that's such a good point. Really quickly before we move on to number 3 is celebration. You could be having a really rough time as a supporter and no one else at the organization that you're supporting would ever know that, right? Because it's not as if you're going to coffee, it's not as if you're having like phone conversations like a friend, but there is something really impactful about celebrating something like that. They may have totally forgotten that they've achieved 100 hours in volunteer hours, that, yes, it's my birthday, but the nonprofit that I, really pour my heart into, they're probably not going to send me a birthday message. And then they do. Talk about the impact that really resonates with a supporter. So I just love that. I feel like we could have a whole conversation about celebration and the power it has in tandem with generosity. But maybe that's a talk for RNS next year. So Rachel, you and I, let's connect on that for next year. But also we kind of touched upon this as well, is time-consuming internal processes. So things like the 5 to 10 hours that our previous organization we mentioned was saving because they were able to automate that receipting process, that thank you and acknowledgement process for those donors. That's incredible. And I'm sure there are other time-consuming processes, examples that we can also include here.
Yeah, and so some of that may look like just having different indicators on records based on just things that donors have done. So for example, right, if you have a region-based portfolio system going on, well, instead of saying, okay, this person lives in New York, we got to put them in the East Coast portfolio, or this person lives in California, we got to manually add them to the West Coast portfolio. You can do that with automation. I can say like, hey, if someone lives in California, that's an audience. Let's put this indicator on there. Hey, if someone lives in New York, let's put this indicator on there. Well, what happens if they move from New York to California? Well, let's take them out of this group and put them in this group. So it kind of takes away all those thinking work pieces as well. And in addition, right, we talked a little bit about receipting and some of these other things. It doesn't even just have to be about adding indicators through your database. It can be something like just gathering more information, right? I know some people may use this time to say, let's send out a survey, right? You could call your donors and ask them a series of questions and mark them all down. You could also just say, hey, like if you sign up for our newsletter, let's include a survey in the next one. And that way, it's just kind of happening on the back end. It's happening almost passively to the experience of your staff, but you're still gathering those additional insights. And then it's coming full circle. You can do something with that information then.
Absolutely. And before we move on, there's a really great question that just came through is there a way to find the number of years a donor has given without scrolling through their giving history? And Rachel, I feel like you can answer this like so well.
So in Virtuous, it really would have to be a way of looking at their giving history. Now, you can look at their first gift date. That is a statistic that we do have in Virtuous. So like as you're pulling lists of donors, you can look at when their first gift date was. And that can tell you like, hey, if their first gift date was back in 2017, I know they've been donating for, 2023 minus 2017, you do the math there. So you do have those statistics available.
Excellent. And that sure beats just having to continuously scroll and try and find that information. But moving on, there are a lot of things that we should be automating, which is great. But on the other hand, there are things that we definitely shouldn't be automating. And that's things like newsletters. So take it from the former fundraising marketing gal, you should definitely not be automating newsletters. And why? Because that content is ever changing. Every month we would always send out a newsletter letting people know of like really wonderful adoption stories, needs that we had, community-driven needs as well. We operated a food bank for families in need or in crisis to help take care of their pets. And that conversation was always evolving. So things that are going to have constant content shifts, make sure you're not automating those. Anything else you would like to add about newsletters?
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of falls under this like larger category of mass communications in general, right? Things that are ever changing, as you had mentioned as well. Sometimes, and there are always going to be exceptions to rules, but I would even say campaign-based items as well, right? Want to make sure that like, hey, if I'm sending out a letter, an appeal letter, it's going to everybody at once, right? And that can even be a logistical thing as well, right? So maybe we kind of sit down at the end of the week and we take that time to stuff envelopes, put stamps on them, all those different kinds of things. And sure, you can certainly do that one by one throughout the week, but it could also be efficient dependent on your process, maybe to just wait till the end there. So campaign-based things, newsletter-based things, again, things that are ever changing, right? You still have to change those things. So it sometimes actually might take you more time to insert that into automation than just to send the thing out.
That's exactly, and I have awful memories of doing bulk mailings by hand and the amount of paper cuts. Oh, bad times.
We're all just like, oh, we remember those days. I know some of you on here are like, oh gosh, I'm still doing that today. And I feel for you.
Yes, same. And I hope that you have very minimal paper cuts and you don't touch anything like hand sanitizer that, always finds those little ones that you forgot about. But, let's bust some myths. So everyone shared earlier in the chat some fears that they had. And here's my favorite part is let's actually bust some of these myths that we have around automation. Rachel, I'm going to kick this one over to you. Let's bust some myths for everybody.
Yeah, and this is a question mark at the end here. And we talked a tad bit about this earlier, right? Automation is impersonal, question mark? No, so automation, in fact, can actually make things more personal for you. So it's not taking away the human connection necessarily. The idea is that you're still connecting with your supporters. The idea is that you're still giving supporters a human being or several human beings to talk to. It's just automating the process of getting to those connections. So option one, you can say, okay, I'm going to take a list of first-time donors that made their first-time gift in the month of May. I'm going to wait till the end of the month, and I'm going to call every one of them. Well, by that time, for your donors who donated on the very first of the month, now they've waited around 30 days to hear from you. That's okay. Depending on the kind of donor that is, they may have forgot they've even donated it. I've certainly done that before. But what if you could have something that basically says, okay, as soon as someone makes a first-time donation, add a task to my development reps dashboard. That way, instead of waiting 30-ish days to reach out to that donor to thank them, they can reach out the next day, maybe the next 2 days. And that's still going to be faster than that 30-day timeline in there. So it's something that's faster, it's more responsive. And now, with that study we had earlier about saying, well, that person has 10 hours of time back in their week. Well, guess what? You can do with those 10 hours. You can use those 10 hours to really sit down and have a rich conversation with your supporters. So it's not just making it less personal. It's actually allowing you more time to have those personal connections. And given the signals that you can go based off of, you can go based off of some really specific signals in here, right? So think about Amazon. You buy something on there and they'll tell you, hey, by the way, you bought this thing. You might be interested in these things. Well, it can work like that too. You're taking specific signals that tell that donor, hey, I know something about you. Not in a creepy way, of course, but in the way that it's just like, hey, I heard you. And I'm not going to give you just a baseline generic kind of conversation that I give to all my donors, but I'm going to give you a conversation that tells me like, hey, I've listened to your celebrations. I know what's going on in your life. Instead of having to take time to get to know all those things, let's just see what our next steps are. What is more that I can learn about you?
I love that. It's not in a creepy way. It's just making you feel special. I love that. Next step too for automation myths, I see a lot of this as well, is do I need to be a coder to do this? And the great news is, no.
No. No.
Thank goodness no.
I mean, you can if you want. Don't let us stop you from having a good time if that's your jam. But no, in a lot of platforms, especially Virtuous, there's no code required here. It's very much almost like a drag and drop kind of format in here. As long as you can identify your audiences and know your journeys, and we'll have that checklist coming up here as well, you can set up automation. You do not have to be a coder to do automation.
That's it too. I mean, coding is obviously a very useful skill to have, having HTML and things like that, but thank goodness inside Virtuous, it's all very, very easy to do. I liken it that maybe like my 6-year-old cousin could probably do it. And actually, she's very smart. She probably could, which is great. And then lastly, for automation myths, it's coming from my job. The robots, they are coming. And thankfully, again, no, automation is definitely not coming for our jobs.
No, it's really like having an extra coworker that you're working with side by side. Right, these are a lot of these things we're already thinking about. My guess is most of you are already thinking about what kind of experiences you want for different kinds of donors. So you're strategizing. Well, guess what? All automation is you being the strategist and having a system execute that plan. Now, the system isn't doing the plan for you in the sense that like it's making the phone calls, but it is telling you, hey, make the phone call, Kelly, so that you can make the phone call. So really, it's just like having another coworker. There still always has to be that person to tell the system what to do. Like I always tell people, like the system's pretty smart, but you as the human are still smarter, right? With automation, someone told automation to do that. Someone told Amazon how to come up with an algorithm that tells you what you would really like to see after that, right? So automation will always, I think, need at least someone there to tell it what to do so that it can do the thing.
Absolutely, too. And for that point as well, I liken that example of like the strategist, and you're just having someone, you're just having that tool, really is what it is, to help execute it. And I like to think back too of the immense amount of random little sticky notes I had all over my desk. I need to make sure I call this person. I need to make sure I drive over and meet with this sponsor. I need to like handwrite this quick thank you note because we just got a contract renewal with a media outlet. You know, having something just prompt me instead, I think one would have saved me a ton of desk space because I had a very small desk, but also just as a gentle reminder as well of the things that we need to do that's really impactful for our work and our mission that oftentimes gets forgotten about when you're rushing from appointment to appointment, you're getting pulled into emergency situations, things oftentimes just slide off of our plates, and it's really nice to have automation. It's almost like an executive assistant just saying, hey, like, here's the next best calls that you should make today. Hey, don't forget to send out, this step today. Oh, guess what? We're actually going to send this email out for you. I'm going to remind you that it's going to go out. So there's just a wealth of helpfulness there. But this is all great. We know what's, wonderful about automation, but, how do I do it, Rachel? How do I actually go and execute all of this wonderful automation magic inside of my CRM?
Yeah, and this is kind of like your checklist. So when you're ready to approach automation, like I think this is definitely something worth coming back to as well. There are going to be a lot of different steps involved in here, but it really kind of ties into that big picture. So first of all, I'm going to start using this baking metaphor. So if you can or cannot bake, I think we'll be able to kind of tie this in. So let's go on this baking journey. So let's say, hey, I want to bake something. I want to learn how to bake. Well, the first thing I need to do is, what tools do I have? Do I have an oven? Do I have an electric mixer? Do I not have an electric mixer? Do I not have a whisk? What tools do I have? Okay, so it's not even just, do I have the tools or not? It's, do I know how to use the tools? Do I know how to use that oven? So I think the first thing with automation is get to know the tools of the system that you have or don't have, right? So if you're using Virtuous for automation, get to know how automation works in Virtuous. If you're using Zapier, if you're using another platform, learn how it works in that platform. As a trainer, I have to highly, encourage the training portion of this as well. Get to know your tools, not just because I want you to learn. Of course, I want you to learn. But also just to understand what it's capable of doing and what it's not capable of doing, right? I never want us to come into this thinking, oh yeah, I can totally automate this thing, and then find out, oh, actually, that was much harder than I imagined, or we can't even automate that. So take some time to get to know how it works, because that is the thing that's going to be executing it.
Absolutely. And by the way, loving the baking metaphor. But yeah, get to know your tools really intimately. Thankfully for Virtuous, we have an entire academy that Rachel and our other trainers built. And I know that Jen has very thankfully shared that link in our chat already. But whether or not you are a Virtuous customer, it is completely free. And I have even heard some feedback from customers recently that if they get stuck on a certain problem inside the platform, they know that they can go to the academy and literally watch a step-by-step way to refresh their memory or fix the issue, which is amazing. And it's so helpful to go in there. I think there's an entire course just on automation that helps show you things. So getting to know your tools is really key here. And then, of course, next step is determining your goals and how you'll meet them. Rachel, kind of walk us through this next part of our baking metaphor.
Yeah, so the next step of the baking metaphor is, great, I want to learn how to bake. What am I going to bake? Okay, cool, let's do a cake. Because who doesn't love cake? And for some of us, it's dessert time, and for some of us, it's breakfast, which can also be dessert. So let's say we want to bake a cake. Great. Now, how does that translate to this automation arena that we have in here? So maybe you want to increase generosity. Great. What kind of generosity? How exactly do you want to do that? Do you want to convert your non-donors to donors? Do you want to convert your new donors to recurring donors? Do you want to recruit new volunteers? So what is it that you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to increase your number of first-time donors? Are you trying to retain your donors? Right? So coming up with that goal, and it kind of sounds like working backwards, and that's exactly what this is. I think that can be really helpful, because once you determine the goals, now you can work backwards from that and determine, how do I get these people to that goal? How do I get to that metric? So I think that's going to streamline us into the next step here. So that's developing the journeys. Okay. So again, how do we get people to that goal, that endpoint? This is where I say always plan in advance. Come back to the A to B formatting in here. If this thing happens, then that thing happens. So the big question here is, who are your audiences? And what do you want to happen for them? Right? It can be something as basic as, cool, I've got my non-donors and I've got my donors. Cool. Now, you can get more specific from there. Well, what happens if I have a non-donor who's actually volunteered before? What if I have a non-donor who has come to an event before? Do I want a different journey for them? What happens if I have a non-donor who never gave us a phone number, right? I can't call them. I don't have a phone number to call. What if I have a non-donor who doesn't have an address? I can't send them a card because they don't have, I don't know where to send that card to, right? So think about a lot of these different conditions in here, because that means you're going to have a lot of different A's, right? If there is this condition that I need this thing to happen. If they don't have a phone number, obviously I can't call them. So we have to scrap that part in there. So you'll have that. help determine your audiences and these different scenarios. And I was seeing in the chat a little bit earlier, right? Thinking about like who to include, who to exclude for that. And always ask yourself, what should happen next, right? Cool, I can say, hey, you sent your first time donation, here's an email. Does it have to stop there? Not necessarily. Maybe you send more emails. Maybe you make a phone call. Maybe you add a tag to their record. It can be a series of actions that can happen there. And then most importantly, how can these journeys help to meet your goal, hit your key metrics, okay? So again, I'm always gonna tie in this same screenshot, this same example in here. So maybe I want my 1K givers to go to the next step of giving 5K. Maybe I put that specific content into that particular email, right? So we've got these different milestones, 1K givers, 5K givers. We can expand that to 10K givers, 20K givers, all kinds of stuff. We can celebrate all kinds of different milestones or maybe just a few milestones. Now, do you have to go with 1K and 5K specifically? That's totally up to you. Every org is different. Every org's got a different layout of donors. But think about what's going to be most appropriate for you. What are realistic journeys for your specific set of supporters?
Yeah, and I really do like that we keep coming back to this example just to really showcase what you can do with it. But just as equally as important as developing journeys, really like digging into goals is setting up your data infrastructure. So I've seen a couple comments come through about some insecurity around data, right? That's always the big one. Is my data clean enough? Is it accurate? Can I actually use it? Do I even trust it? Which is a really big one. How can folks who have that fear around their data infrastructure be able to set it up properly so they can actually use automation?
Yeah, so I like to compare this to, getting your grocery list together, taking inventory of what you already have. Going back to that baking example in here, right? Maybe you already have flour. That's cool. But is it expired? Okay? We don't want to use expired flour for this cake, or maybe like potato starch or whatever it is you're using there. So check on your ingredients. If they're expired, you need new ingredients. You need to work on that. So maybe you need to go to the grocery store and buy some new things, right? So with your data management, I'm going to kind of tie this back to the example before around, hey, maybe I've got some West Coast and some East Coast donors as well. So the thing is, well, if I've got those donors and I want to be able to assign to those different groups, the groups have to be there, okay? The indicators have to exist. If I want to add a tag to a record, the tag has to exist in the database first. Otherwise, the system doesn't know what tag to add to somebody. If I'm going to build out emails and I want an email series for this, well, the system doesn't know what I want to say in my emails, so I have to build out that content. I need to build out the emails themselves. So it's a little bit of management, making sure the ingredients are there, and a little bit of health, making sure the ingredients are actually good to use, right? Because I know it's kind of terrifying, the idea of saying, hey, I just sent a non-donor email to someone who's actually donated before. So check for your duplicates. Make sure that the data is nice and consistent so that we can use that data. And of course, that's easier said than done, right? Data health is a process. It is not like something that we all reach and we're all like, good, we have 100% data health all the time. That would be unrealistic. And if it's you, please let me know, because I've got to know your secrets.
Yes.
But yes, so it is making sure that you're staying on top of your data health, even if you've got small systems to tackle it day by day, and making sure that you have the infrastructure set up so that when we are ready to launch this automation, the email's ready. When we're ready to launch this automation, the portfolio can be assigned. And so that kind of takes us into this next step of setting up your automation. Now, this has a whole slide of bulleted points in here, and we'll go through this, and you'll notice there's like a really interesting image here. I'll get into that a little bit later as well. So let's put this all together. So what is your criteria exactly, right? We might know and say, hey, I want to send out some emails to someone who reached a 1K milestone or a 5K milestone. That's great. How do you tell the system that that's your audience, right? And that's where in Virtuous, something like queries will come in, right? What parameters do you use to make sure you're including the right people? So for our statistics, we might say, hey, life-to-date giving is greater than or equal to $1,000. Okay, so thinking through the parameters in your criteria, that can get a little more complicated. depending on those audiences that you have. So it's not just as simple as, cool, I've got a non-donor audience, and the system just magically knows what that is. You do have to tell the system who those audiences are. Now, consider your criteria that you're using, whether it's in queries in Virtuous or criteria in a different database, and consider its relationship to when automation runs and the timeline to the journey. So understanding when automation runs is already part of that first step I mentioned earlier in getting to know your tools. So for example, in Virtuous, automation runs once a day, every day, early morning. So we have to be careful about any time-based criteria we have in there. So for example, if I have an automation set up to thank donors every time they make a donation, I don't want my gift date set as today in the query or in the parameter or in the criteria. Because if the automation runs before I've even entered the gift in the database, that person's not going to get pulled in. And that's kind of sad. Unless you're entering gifts at 3 in the morning, which please don't do that. Please get some sleep. I highly advocate for your health. Please don't do that. But do consider that and consider the date ranges you're using in your criteria. And then also consider its timeline in the journey. There's one common pitfall I see in which people accidentally kick people out of the journeys before they can even finish them. And that might happen because, I've used a time-based date range in my criteria. So say, for example, their first-time gift has to be within 30 days of when this runs. Well, if my email series is going to be about 45 days, well, they're not going to get that last 15-day chunk of actions because they're already out. So be really careful about your date ranges that you're using, especially those relative date ranges. Consider actions that may change the audience's criteria. So for example, I might have a workflow that is for prospects. And at the end of that workflow, I might have that prospect tag deleted. Well, once that prospect tag is out because automation did it, they're no longer in there. Okay? They no longer qualify. Now, entrance and exit strategy, this image on the left, that's where that's coming in here. What's equally as important to getting your audience in the door is getting them out, right? So in this, I dabble in the aerial arts here and there, and you can get in a pose. That's great. You can't be stuck in the air the whole time, though, right? You have to come down. So make sure you can get them out of there as gracefully as possible. Should this journey repeat? Okay, there are some instances when the journey should and when the journey shouldn't. If it is milestone-based, it should not repeat, right? You become a first-time donor once, you become a 1K donor once, you become a 5K donor once. I don't want to be getting repeated emails of the same emails for something that already happened before. Now, in some instances, let's say we want to retain lapsed donors, we do want that to repeat. I do want to make sure our rep is reaching out to our donors who have lapsed every time they lapse. We still want to pull them back in every single time. And lastly, how these actions might impact metrics or even other automation flows, right? You can use this to help pull in data. Maybe we're adding contact notes via Virtuous and then tracking how many contact notes have been added. Maybe this thing that happens in this workflow qualifies that person for another workflow. So that's where we start to think about not just a single workflow or a single automation, but this library of automations that you have in here.
That's all great. And I know that's a lofty amount of bullets too, but in case everyone's like, oh my gosh, I need so much more than that, the slides will be provided after this talk. I know that we only have just a couple more minutes, and honestly, I feel like we could spend literally like 5 hours talking about all of this information, but just to make sure that we get through the remaining part of our slides, first and foremost, one of the last things too is making sure that you can test it out if possible. Make sure that you can actually go through, work out any kinks, anything that might be kind of buggy of an experience, for these automation workflows as well, because we want to make sure that we have a really smooth journey for folks. And then of course is making sure there's a plan B. What happens if you do press the go button and oh no, something does go wrong? We'll take a deep breath. Mistakes do happen. And it's, at the end of the day, fixable, which is wonderful. So nothing is ever cemented in stone, but always make sure that you have a plan B, when those mistakes happen. How will you talk about mistakes with your donors. I always like to lean on the humanizing approach of just admitting that something did go wrong and that you're sorry. There's always a great example of like, oh no, like my dog ate my homework, our dog ate our emails, we're so sorry because there was something incorrect inside of that content. So just making sure that there is a plan B, and then of course set it and forget it for now. Making, once you've got all the kinks worked out, everything works really beautifully, you've got the content right, you've got your segments right, your journey is planned out to a T, let it go, launch it, celebrate, high five your coworkers, and really celebrate this moment. And then over time is to evaluate. Are you meeting your goals? Are you using these automations to meet the goals and expectations that you've outlined for these journeys? And then once you feel really comfortable, it's of course build more. We always want to be building more automations to help your team do everything possible. There are just a few tips and tricks here on how to go from fear to expert. We only have just a couple seconds here, and I'm so very sorry. We will be sharing an ebook in the chat to help you with the crawl, walk, run methodology. We do not want you to set up automations and just be like, I need 20 steps. Absolutely not. Please don't do that if this is your first ever one. Simply start off something small with 2 to 3 steps. And our ebook will walk you through that. And then how to scale that to more complex actions. Reach out to your account manager with questions too. If you are a Virtuous customer, of course you have an account manager. They are more than happy to assist you with questions that you may have. And of course, use the Academy and the Help Center, which we have shared throughout today's session. But Rachel, thank you so much for being with us here today. This was a wonderful conversation, and I just appreciate everyone to spend time with us here. Up next on the technology stage, we will be welcoming Nicholas from KindCatch. He is the founder and CEO, but then he is also the founder and CEO of Fleece and Thank You to talk about 5 marketing trends that you need to know as we go into the 23 and 24 giving season. So please feel free to take a break, and we will see you back here in just a few minutes. Thank y'all.